Hello students, so in this video I'll be discussing about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So all of you know flowering plants are placed under the group Angiosperms, and that is the most dominant group of plant in the present world. So when we are talking about sexual reproduction in flowering plants, the reproductive organ system of a plant is the flower, and flower is the reproductive organ which has different floral parts. So first we'll be discussing about the typical parts of a bisexual flower. So generally a bisexual flower has got four parts. The outermost part consists of small green leaf-like structure. So these are called the sepals. So the function of the sepals is that during a bud condition, you must have seen a flower bud. So when a flower bud is in a closed condition like this, so the sepals are actually protecting the internal delicate floral parts from mechanical damage by insects or other means. So that is the function of sepals. Now all the sepals are together called calyx. The collective name for all the sepals is calyx. The next floral part, which lies inner to the sepals, is the most prominent part of a flower, which is either brightly colored or they have very strong smell, and those are called petals. The collective name for all the petals is called corolla. So what is the function of the petals? The petals, they are either brightly colored or they have strong smell in order to attract insects for the purpose of pollination. Generally the flowers which bloom during daytime, they are brightly colored, and the flowers which bloom at night, they generally don't have color, but instead of that they have strong smell. Now if you have seen any flower where the pollination does not occur by insect but by, let's say, factors like wind, so in those flowers the petals are altogether absent. For example, suppose if we take the case of maize, suppose there is a maize plant. So you must have seen maize plant, the edible part, the corn which we say, that is actually the female flower. It is having just the basic female parts, and on top these are the male flowers. So they lack actually the petals because they don't have to attract wind for the purpose of pollination. So the next interior part, interior to the petals, are the male reproductive part. The male reproductive part is called the stamen. Each stamen consists of two parts. There is a flat capsule-like structure on top, and this capsule-like structure is called the anther, which is supported by a long wire-like structure which is called the filament. So anther and the filament together, it forms the stamen. This is the symbol for male. So the stamens, all the stamen taken together, the collective name is androecium. Next we come, so it is in the anther that the male gametes or the male reproductive units will be formed, and these male reproductive units are called the pollen grains. It is produced in the anther by the process of meiosis. The interiormost part of the flower, it is the female reproductive part. It is called the pistil or the carpel. This is the symbol for female, and each pistil or carpel has got three parts. The flat top, it is called the stigma, which acts as a landing platform for the pollen grains. Then we have a tubular structure which is called the style, and we have a bulbous base, a bulb-like base, a rounded base, which is called the ovary. It is inside the ovary that the female gamete will be formed, and the female gamete is called the ovule. So the pistil might look like one single tube, but in most of the cases it is actually a fused portion of many pistils taken together. So all the pistils taken together, the collective name is called gynoecium. So that's the overall structure of a typical bisexual flower. And all these floral parts, sepals, petals, stamen and pistil, are held on a flat base, and that is called the thalamus, which is connected with the branch or the stem with the help of a stalk. Next we come to pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Now when the pollen grains are getting transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. Similar If the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but in the same plant, then also it's a case of self-pollination, because genetically the flowers are same because they are borne by the same plant. But if the pollen grains are transferred from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower in a different plant, then it is called cross-pollination. Now generally for cross-pollination to take place, you require different types of pollinating agents. So what are the different pollinating agents that we have? Let us see. So depending on the pollinating agents, suppose the pollinating agent is the wind, then we call such flower as anemophilous flowers. You must have heard about anemometer, which measures the speed of wind. So anemo term is related with wind, so it is called anemophilous flowers. Next is the insect pollinated flower. Insect pollinated flowers are those flowers which have, I told you, showy petals to attract the insects. They are called entomophilous flowers. Next we have flowers which are pollinated by water. They are called hydrophilous. Animals, zoophilous, like that different terms are there. So depending on the pollinating agents, we can give different names. Next we come to the actual process of reproduction, which is called fertilization. You know what is fertilization? That it is the meeting or fusion of what? Male gamete and female gamete to form the cell which will form the next generation, and that is called the zygote. So that is called fertilization. So in case of plants, the male gamete is the pollen grain and the female gamete is the ovule. So let us try to understand. You have got mitosis and meiosis in class 9. So what happens is that in case of flower, in the ovary, at the two ends of the ovary, meiosis takes place, and as a result of meiosis, generally you should understand this in brief. If I tell you, suppose there is one cell and it is a diploid cell, diploid, diploid. Diploid means which is having double the number of chromosomes. When this cell will undergo meiosis, meiosis takes place in two steps. In the first step, two cells will be formed which will have half the number of chromosome. These are called haploid cells. When the chromosome number becomes half, it is called haploid. Next, this cell will further once again divide into two haploid cells. This will also divide into two haploid cells. So all the cells are haploid. So in meiosis, from one diploid cell, we end up getting 4 haploid cells. So here also one meiosis takes place. At this end also one meiosis takes place. So here also 4 cells will be formed. Here also 4 cells will be formed. Now this ovary, it has a fine opening here. This opening is called the micropyle. This is called the micropylar end, and this end opposite to the micropyle, it is called the chalaza. It is called the chalaza, chalazal end. Okay, so CHALAZA. So micropylar end will have 4 haploid cells. At the chalazal end will have 4 haploid cells. Now what happens? From the chalazal end, one cell will come, and from the micropylar end, another cell will come, and they will fuse in the center. So when they fuse in the center, they form a cell with 2 nucleus in it, and that's called the primary endosperm nucleus. It is actually diploid in nature. Haploid cell will combine and it will form a diploid primary endosperm nucleus. Now out of the 3 cells which will be left in the micropylar end, one cell will become bigger in size, and that will act as the ovule or the female gamete. The other 2 cells remain small. They are called the synergids. And at the opposite end, towards the chalazal end, also 3 cells remain. Those are called the antipodal cells. So that is the development which occurs in the ovary. Now when the pollen grain will land on the stigma, from there, due to some chemicals which are released from ovary, a pollen tube will start developing. Okay, and the pollen nucleus is already haploid in nature. It is having half the number of chromosomes. So as the pollen tube grows, in most of the cases, pollen tube enters through the micropyle. There are few cases where they might enter through the chalaza or from the side, but in most of the cases they enter through the pollen tube enters through the micropyle. Now as the pollen tube starts growing, the male nucleus will start traveling through the pollen tube, and as it travels, it divides to form 2 male nuclei. Okay, so both the male nuclei will be haploid in nature. So let us see what happens during fertilization. Fertilization, as I told you, meeting of the male and the female gamete. So the first male nucleus, which is haploid, it will fuse with the ovule, which is the female gamete, and it will end up forming a diploid zygote. Whereas the second male nucleus, it will fuse with primary endosperm nucleus, and it will form a triploid secondary endosperm nucleus. Diploid plus haploid, it will form a triploid secondary endosperm nucleus. So that is the fertilization phase. Now let us try to understand what will happen after fertilization of the different floral parts, because along with this you have the petals, you have the sepals. So fate of floral parts after fertilization. So generally in most of the cases the petals and sepals, they fall off, but not always. Like example brinjal, you must have seen the cap. That is actually the sepal which is retained. Even in tomatoes the sepals are retained. So in some cases they are retained, like pomegranate. If I've seen a pomegranate, it looks somewhat like this. This leathery cover of the pomegranate, that is actually the petals, because a pomegranate flower, it is a very delicate flower having very thin petals, but when the fruit will start developing inside, the petals become leathery and they form the cover. So in some cases the petals and sepals may be retained, but in most of the cases the petals, they simply fall off. The fate of other parts, like in case of the ovule will, I told you, it will fuse with the pollen nucleus and will form zygote, and the primary endosperm nucleus will fuse with pollen nucleus to form the secondary endosperm nucleus. Now both this zygote and secondary endosperm nucleus will result in formation of seed. Actually the secondary endosperm nucleus forms a structure which is called endosperm. Endosperm is a specialized structure inside seed which stores food for the newly growing plant, the plant which will grow from the seed, that will be provided food by endosperm. So secondary endosperm nucleus develops into endosperm, and endosperm and zygote together, it forms the seed. In many cases at class 10 level, it is directly said that the ovule will change into zygote, which will change into the seed, but actually the seed is a very complex structure which will develop by combination of this zygote and endosperm. And the ovary, that bulbous structure that we got, this bulb-like structure inside which the ovule was formed, this entire ovary will develop into the fruit. So that is the fate of different floral parts after fertilization. The last part is germination of seed. So this diagram you have studied in your lower classes, how the small from a seed, when it is put under the soil, a small plantlet grows out. So initially the root will start growing, and after the root grows, then the shoot will start growing, because first the root has to grow, because it has to start absorbing nutrients and water, and after that only it can support the shoot. So the portion which will develop into the root, that is called the radicle, and the portion which will develop into the shoot, that is called the plumule. So in a typical dicot seed means which has two cotyledons. Now cotyledons, in case of dicot seeds, I told you that food for the new plant is stored in endosperm, but in case of dicot seed, the function of endosperm is taken over by another structure which is called cotyledon. Now suppose we take a gram seed. You soak a gram seed in water and you can separate it into two parts. Those are called the cotyledons. So dicot seed has two cotyledon, and from the cotyledon, this embryo, this growing new plant, this baby plant is called the embryo. The upper part is the plumule which will develop into future shoot, and we have the radicle which will develop into future root. So the plumule and radicle together, it is called the embryo. Similarly, like monocot seed, in monocot seed the storage of food is carried out by endosperm. Let's take a maize seed. You cannot separate a maize seed into two parts, so it is like rice. So all the cereals, wheat, rice, then your maize, all these cereals are actually monocot. So the food will be stored in the endosperm. Cotyledon is a very reduced structure here, and this is the embryo. So the upper part is the plumule and the lower part is the radicle. Together it is the embryo. So this is the overall reproductive sexual reproduction in case of flowering plants. I hope the concepts are clear to you. Thank you so much.